NATO's nuclear policy is in disarray as West German ministers fly to Washington, determined to go it alone, talking with the Soviets. Hello, good evening. The fragile agreement within the NATO alliance not to talk to Moscow about removing short-range nuclear weapons from Europe breaks down. Germany's foreign and defence ministers fly to Washington for crisis talks. Messrs Thatcher and Bush agree by telephone to do everything possible to bring the Germans back into line. NATO's Secretary-General plays down the crisis and says, "Give us time, we can get it right." We talk to Bonn and Washington. Also tonight, a Commons committee tells Nigel Lawson he's walking a tightrope between slump and still higher inflation. The electricians and the engineers narrowly failed to agree to a merger that would have made them Britain's second biggest union. The Royal Ulster Constabulary confirms that South Africa did supply weapons to extremist Protestant groups in the province. The Berlin Philharmonic and their legendary conductor Herbert von Karajan agree to part. Was he pushed or did he bow out? In the build-up to next month's local government elections, the broken alliance battle to prevent their shires slipping back to the Tories. And the leading lady of the English novel, Iris Murdoch, after a gap of 20 years, brings her work to the West End stage.
Don't leave me! I'll kill myself!
But first, the NATO alliance faces one of the most damaging crises in its 40-year history. Both the United States and Britain are furious with Germany after the coalition government in Bonn calls for talks with the Soviet Union on the reduction of short-range nuclear missiles. Two leading West German ministers, the Defence Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg and the Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, are tonight in Washington for talks aimed at diffusing the problem. They're reported to be meeting stiff opposition from the Americans. Mrs Thatcher will go to Germany at the weekend for a summit with Chancellor Kohl. Britain is in the forefront of an alliance drive to heal the rift before the NATO summit next month. Mrs Thatcher has long been suspicious of Helmut Kohl's commitment to modernising the Western alliance's frontline nuclear defence. She has shown no sympathies for the spirit of compromise in Bonn, brought about both by Dr Kohl's own domestic political problems and his growing enchantment with the overtures from President Gorbachev. Now Britain is in the forefront of NATO attempts to bring the Germans into line. On Saturday night, President Bush made a 20-minute phone call to Mrs Thatcher ahead of today's visit to Washington by the German ministers. Tonight, Mrs Thatcher will hold talks with the new American ambassador in London, Henry Cato. The NATO crisis is expected to be high on the agenda. The Foreign Office also invited the German ministers to stop off in London on their way home from Washington. The Germans declined. But Mrs Thatcher is paying what's billed as a private visit to Chancellor Kohl at his hometown of Oggersheim on Sunday. Her mission will be to secure a change of mind from the German leader. At the heart of the dispute is the rift over whether NATO's ageing American Lance missiles based in West Germany should be replaced. The West Germans say the weapons give them an increased share of the nuclear threat, but the line being pursued by both Britain and the United States is that on the 40th anniversary of the alliance, a need for unity is paramount, and modernisation is necessary. The West Germans are now being accused of undermining NATO policy. It was at a nuclear planning group meeting in Brussels last Thursday that defence ministers agreed to paper over differences. Short-range nuclear weapons would only be modernised where necessary. A decision on Lance would be postponed until the early 1990s. But that evening in Bonn, Chancellor Kohl's three-party coalition cabinet met into the small hours. In the end, they agreed to oppose replacement of the Lance and, more alarmingly to the NATO hawks, to press for talks with Moscow on a reduction of short-range missiles. A dark cloud now hangs over the NATO summit, due to take place in Brussels in just 5 weeks' time. The meeting of Western leaders will celebrate the 40th anniversary of the organisation, but it will also have to face up to one of its most damaging splits. In Washington, the American Defense Secretary Dick Cheney said the United States would resist opening talks with the Soviet Union on short-range nuclear weapons. That message was also being firmly underlined at a meeting between the US Secretary of State, James Baker, and the two West German ministers. Our Washington correspondent, Michael Crick, has this report.
For President Bush and the American military establishment, this morning provided an opportunity for a memorial service for the 47 sailors who died in the gun explosion on the battleship Iowa last week. The Iowa accident has intensified the debate in military circles over whether such battleships, built during the Second World War, are now out of date and ought to be still in service. But 200 miles up the Atlantic coast, controversy was raging over a different kind of military modernization, with the sudden arrival of the German foreign and defense ministers. They'd come to tell the State Department that they want NATO to negotiate with the Soviets over short-range nuclear weapons in Europe, the so-called Third Zero. But Bush administration officials insist that such talks would be premature.
Nuclear weapons have been the main offset to overwhelming Soviet conventional superiority for 40 years in Europe. And I would not want to be in a position now where we embark upon negotiations because of the danger we'd end up with a third zero. The Soviets have always wanted to denuclearize Europe. That's still their goal and objective. And if we embark now on short-range nuclear force negotiations, there's a very real danger we'd end up in that position.
Cheney and his colleague James Baker say that until there's progress in the new Vienna conventional arms talks, the short-range Lance missile, and preferably a modernized replacement, are necessary to offset the Warsaw Pact superiority in conventional arms.
Baker is reflecting a holdover attitude from the Reagan administration, which really desired to force Lance modernization as a reaffirmation of the existence of the forward-deployed nuclear weapons. Everyone recognizes that that is politically infeasible, undesirable, unnecessary, and can't happen. And I think Baker, having gone to Europe on that basis, has now recognized the inevitability of not proceeding with Lance modernization at the moment.
Meanwhile, the administration has revealed several important military spending decisions. The stealth bomber is being delayed a year, while technical and money problems are sorted out. There'll be a cut of almost 20% on Star Wars research over the next 5 years. And on the controversial issue of making long-range nuclear missiles more mobile, there'll be a fudged compromise, developing the small midget man weapons on lorries alongside plans to transfer the much stronger MX missiles to railway trucks. They were all choices dictated more by political and budget stringency rather than long-term strategy, and as the new Defense Secretary frankly admits, weren't always to his liking.
If it were my decision to make today, I'd spend more on defense and have real growth in defense on a steady, stable basis over time. That's not an option. The President and the Congress have made a decision that the budget will be cut. Now, the fact is the reduction this year is less than it was over the last 4 years, but still defense has come down about 12% over the last 5 years.
Mr. Secretary.
It is difficult under those circumstances to make the decisions that have to be made, but I have to do it.
Having resolved the domestic defense issues involved in next year's Pentagon budget, administration officials are likely to find their international defense problems far more intractable. And despite today's visit by the Germans, it seems that the Germans' concerns over short-range nuclear weapons are unlikely to be sorted out before next month's 40th anniversary NATO meeting in Europe. Michael Crick, ITN, Washington.
Well, earlier I spoke to NATO's Secretary-General Manfred Wörner, who's also a former West German defense minister. I put it to him that the alliance had been formed precisely to avoid the problem it's now facing.
This alliance is an alliance of sovereign and free states. It has always had differences of opinion, but it always found common and reasonable solutions. This is not only a German problem, it's a problem of this alliance, but I think we will find a solution.
Now, the reason you're here in London is precisely to celebrate 40 years of NATO. But hasn't it, and doesn't this problem perhaps illustrate the point, hasn't it been 40 years in which you've done some very clever fudging? You've managed to put off the worst of the problems, you've managed to get round them, but in the end you've never had to assault these problems head on, and now you've got to do it.
Since NATO existed, journalists, even nice journalists like you, always said NATO is in a crisis. We always were in the media considered to be a major crisis. There have been much more, say, dangerous situations than nowadays. What did we achieve? We turned around the tide of history. Communism failed. We are on the advance. Our values count. How can I be pessimistic? I am optimistic. The mainstream of events, history is working in favor of NATO. We did what was needed, and we are dominating the agenda. So if we show the necessary cohesion, try to proceed on the way we have gone so far, I am not afraid of the future, contrary to that.
But you've had 36 years of the 40 without Gorbachev. 4 years produced change in the Soviet Union, which was equivalent to far more than anything happened in the 35 years previously.
Okay, let Gorbachev have the headlines. As long as he is moving towards our values, as long as he is taking even our language, and as long as he is opening up, as long as he is on the way we wanted him to go.
Now, what many of your predecessors, and indeed what you yourself have warned against, has been the fact that the Soviets could drive a wedge into NATO, dividing one country from another. This has surely come about, this present problem, precisely because the Germans are attracted by Mr. Gorbachev's new openings. Isn't that wedge now in place?
There's not yet a wedge. Of course, there is a chance for the Soviets to look at it like a wedge, but I still am confident that we can close it. But do not point only to the Germans. There are other nations sharing their views. Now, I would not minimize this rift, but on the other side, as I try to say to you, I'm still confident that we can come to a common solution. And clearly, we had such a tremendous success as alliance because we showed political cohesion and military strength. And this is our recipe also for the future, to remain strong in deterrence and defense. That means we need nuclear and conventional weapons, and we need to keep them up to date. That is clear. On the other hand, we have always showed preparedness for dialogue and cooperation. In fact, we produced the change in the East. So now we will make use of it.
You've got 5 weeks before the crucial NATO summit. You must admit the odds are against you finding a solution. If Germany decides to stick to this line, and we've got the Gorbachev visit coming up in Germany immediately after the NATO summit, what's NATO going to do about it?
Well, you say the odds are against us. How can you know? How can you know? They just took a position. They started to talk, first with the Americans. I think they'll talk to others. And we'll talk inside the alliance and try to find a solution. Give us the time to prove. And if you are right, okay, I think I will be right.
Manfred Werner, the NATO Secretary General. Joining me now from Washington is Kenneth Edelman, a former director of the US Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and from our studio in Bonn, Thomas Kielinger, the editor of the weekly journal Rheinischer Merkur. Mr. Edelman, the seeds of this problem were sown, surely, well on your watch. I mean, certainly in 1987 people could have told us we'd be here today. Indeed, many forecast it. Much of the blame must come down to you for not moving hard enough then, and perhaps now to Mr. Bush for doing very little in the opening months of his administration.
I think it was foreseeable that there would be a rush for a denuclearization of Europe. But I think it's foreseeable as well that there'd be a rush back to that, away from that, seeing that the denuclearization of Western Europe would just play into Soviet hands. It would make war more likely. And I think that what we have to do is to keep our heads screwed on right on what is the important thing that the NATO alliance has successfully done for 40 years. It's not that it's deployed nuclear weapons for 40 years. It's that it has stopped Soviet aggression for 40 years. And that part of that stopping of aggression has been because of nuclear weapons. And I think that to get off that winning ticket right now, to surrender while we're on the verge of victory, is really a very foolhardy thing to do.
Mr. Edelman, you're almost singing the same song that we've just heard from Manfred Werner. In other words, looking very much to the success of NATO's past. Surely the whole problem does lie with the future, and the immediate future, 5 weeks before the summit. Do you share his view that a solution to this crisis can be delivered in